Okay, thank you so very much for the kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here this morning in Taiwan to talk about things that I'm really passionate about, building better businesses. So in 2020, I wrote this book, Better Business, and I'm really proud and excited that it's now translated into traditional Chinese, and I believe that all of you have copies, so very excited that it's going to be helping spread this mission in Taiwan. I also want to mention one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here is that I'm the Sin-E professor at Cambridge, and Sin-E also is a very sort of valuable donor of Zhengzhi Daxue, and the Sin-E school is sponsoring this event, so I really appreciate their help. And finally, I want to mention some recent news about the Cambridge Business School. Actually, the Executive Education Department is organized as a corporation, and we recently certified as a B Corporation just in March, so that's very exciting. So I think that, we're the only top business school that actually is certified as a B Corporation, so hopefully many of you come and visit us and take some of our programs. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how companies can be best for the world, as Mr. Zhang had mentioned. So many global issues exist, I'm sure things that many of you are passionate about helping resolve. Climate change, inequality, business frequently gets blamed for causing these. And I think maybe there is some issues of culpability. However, also business can play a really important role in solving them. I think that many of the issues that exist are really from some of the systemic issues around financial markets and how businesses are really very much focused on short-term issues, and how we can think about long-term issues is also very important. However, there's many various institutions and norms and processes that really stand in business's way, and this is where I think the B Corp movement is so incredibly valuable because it actually provides a way, a set of methods and tools and processes to actually overcome many of these problems. So in the book, Better Business, what I actually articulate is some of the different dimensions that are essential to become actually a much more better performing business. And the reason why I titled the book Better Business is actually because so many of the companies that I interviewed, I originally contacted them because of their social and environmental focus. And I said, I want to learn about, how you're becoming more socially and environmentally responsible through this B Corp movement. And what they said is that actually this has made us a better business overall. So I think also in line with what Mr. Zhang mentioned earlier. So there's many amazing B Corps around the world. It's been incredible to see this movement explode in Taiwan. I visited a few yesterday. Now there's 8,500 B Corps around the world, which is a huge and important number. However, it really pales in comparison to the number of businesses overall. And I think to really engage in change of these systems and climate change and inequality, helping resolve them, we need more than 8,500 companies, or even more than the number of companies that can be B corporations. We actually need to help transition the overall system. And so I think this is where the movement around B corporations has been so important because it's introduced a number of accountability and governance standards that not just can help B corporations, but can help all companies. And so, this is really where I focus the book, not just about companies becoming B corporations, but how the B Corp model and B Corp tools can help every company in the world actually become better. So one example of a B corporation, just to give you a sense of how this, is operationalized, so to speak. I know there's many B Corps in the room, and probably this is, obviously things you're very, very familiar with. But you can see a company like Patagonia, arrayed across the different B Corp elements, from governance, workers, community, does very well. Patagonia is really famous for its environmental commitment, so it does well on environment. But one of the things I think is so important is if you look at this right-hand side here and see how the B impact score has grown over time. And what Patagonia representatives have told me is that this created an important set of tools for them to actually become more socially and environmentally engaged. So you can see their score sort of go up. And as many of the B Corps in the room know that have certified and recertified, actually the certification process gets harder over time. So the fact that they're actually able to increase their score is really a testament to how this has helped them as well. This idea of ESG And assessing companies, sort of climate and environment and worker, sort of aspects is something also that is increasingly important in the broader world. You have leading investors, saying ESG is really important as a way to understand long-term risk, management quality for companies. And I think this is really, really important. And many of the early sort of systems around ESG, like the Global Reporting Initiative you might have heard of, have taken this perspective of companies should voluntarily do this, and actually it's something that once they start doing it, it'll be like Patagonia, and they'll keep getting better and better. Sort of this, saying from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So by opening up the company, by being transparent, it allows for scrutiny and actually the opportunity to be better. I think this was actually the old logic, and that we're actually undergoing a really important turning point in companies' accountability on environmental and social aspects. So you had this system where B-Lab, GRI, many institutions have really developed rigorous and important systems, but these mostly have been voluntary. In the future, I think there's going to be much more mandatory scrutiny on ESG. So this positions B Corps and companies that do the BIA very, very well for this future environment. So the EU has recently introduced a very rigorous environmental and social reporting system under the CSRD, this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The important things about this are that actually it is mandatory. Directors and managers can be sued if they don't, adhere correctly. It also has global applications. So any company that is actually doing business in the or any reasonably sized company that is doing business in the EU will have to report on their global operations. And it's not just about financial materiality, so items like carbon emissions that have an investor impact, but also about impact materiality, how actually the company is influencing the global standards on social and environmental. So I think this is a very important turning point that actually makes B corporations well positioned for the future. And countries like Taiwan, like was mentioned, there's 1 million SMEs. So the SMEs are actually in the global supply chains of many of the companies that are going to have to report on this. And the more they're focused on these issues, the greater competitiveness they'll be. So that is the y-axis. The second item I talk about in the book is around governance. So part of the problem with companies actually being called out for greenwashing or not being able to engage in their social and environmental commitments is that there's a gap between the governance of the firm and what the company is actually saying. And so I think that this new type of governance called benefit corporation, where companies actually in their legal articles of incorporation, articulate a purpose beyond just shareholder focus, but actually to all stakeholders is really, really important. This is spread throughout the world. Many U.S. states, many countries around the world have adopted this. But again, this is only voluntary. Actually, a number of countries, including the UK, the EU is starting to do some of this, as well as Canada, have actually started to engage in changing their corporate law in general to make this a mandatory process. So again, I think B corporations really are on the cutting edge and actually going to be well set up for the future competitive environment. So I want to mention something as well about what's going on today and what's going on in the future. So the book I wrote was in 2020, and I think that the processes that I articulated in that from the B Corp movement are still very relevant if a company wants to be sustainable. But I wrote a new book, which is coming out just in a few weeks in the US, called The Profiteers, which sounds a bit different than Better Business. This has a much more sort of critical spin. And I think it's very important to think about this next phase of social responsibility, of sustainability, and holding larger companies more to account. So in general, my argument that I make in this book is that there's been a lot of focus on stakeholders and stakeholder capitalism. And certainly, companies addressing consumers, employees, the environment is really, really important. But without actually looking at their underlying core business model, we can very much miss a lot. they can be doing positive things for their stakeholders, but actually negative things in their business model. And I think the B Corps here too, where they have impact business model evaluation, also are well set up. So just an example of this, Pepsi is a company that is actually rewarded for a number of awards for its stakeholder capitalism. So you can see here this Just Capital. It's one of the top companies in stakeholder capitalism, via this rating. However, I apologize if there's anyone from Pepsi here in the room, but Pepsi's business model is really destructive to the world. So the chemicals and ingredients and engineering of their foods, of their drinks, actually lead to the obesity epidemic. Some of them are potentially carcinogenic. They make this choice. They don't actually have to include these ingredients, but it makes their business sort of run better. Also, there's been surveys of plastic in the world, and Pepsi bottles are the second most likely found. They lead the water crises in a number of places. So Pepsi, as an example, extreme example of where they're getting, sort of lauded for their stakeholder focus, but actually people are not really looking at their business model. I think we need to actually put much more scrutiny on companies' business models, and this is why I wrote this new book. In many ways, sort of conceptual parts of the book focus on this idea of externalities. And this is about how companies have spillovers, negative and positive spillovers from their business to society they don't have to pay for. Carbon pollution is a famous example where people are talking about carbon taxes or carbon payments because companies pollute and they don't actually get charged for that pollution. Similar to plastic. This is very akin to this tragedy, the commons parable, which we probably learned about in school, that when companies overuse common resources, things get worse and worse for all of us. And I think we need to really be thinking about these common resources and how companies, through their business models, are either taking from or adding to. I think a lot of B Corps are actually the ones that are adding to, and we need to put a lot more scrutiny and demand the companies that are taking from the commons actually be held accountable for that. So one example of this that I cover in the book is plastics. So plastics are ubiquitous in the world and getting more and more used, but a very, very small percentage of plastics, even though we all put them in the right bin, are recycled. Of the plastics that are put in recycling systems, maybe 9% is an optimistic estimate. Many estimates are around 5% of plastics actually are recycled. However, Pepsi then and other major beverage companies, sort of have ads saying we're all working together, creating recycling systems, but actually they should be doing things like trying to avoid the use of plastic instead of actually, promoting recycling. So a company and actually a B corporation that I think represents the future of how to think about this is called Grove Collaborative. And I sort of research them and write about them in the book, and this is their co-founder, Stu Landsberg. So they make consumer products and sell consumer products, things like shampoos, things like home goods, et cetera. And he said to me, actually, the biggest externality of their business is plastic. This is something, anything that is shipped as a liquid, can't be packaged in paper because it'll leak. And so they really dedicated their business to trying to address this issue. And to address this issue means starting with the redesign of the products. So they think about how can we redesign our products so they use less water? How can we redesign our products so they can be packaged different ways? And actually, they're on their way to becoming plastic-free as a consumer products business. And so think about actually if a company like Pepsi would much more seriously think about, okay, we're not going to encourage people to recycle, but we're actually going to think about how to fundamentally remove this, this material from our waste stream. This idea of externalities is endemic. If you look at most industries in the world, if they actually were charged for their externalities, they would have no profits, actually. So they are basically making profits off of the public commons, all of our things. Another company sort of come back to Patagonia that has been very forward-thinking in this. described to me how actually considering their externalities and negative benefit on the world resulted in some really fundamental reevaluations of their business. So this is someone named Vincent Stanley, worked at Patagonia for 40 years. He's currently called the director of philosophy because he writes a lot with the founder, Jan Chenard, a number of the books that you probably read, Let My People Go Surfing, were co-authored by him. And he said, when Patagonia started a food business called Patagonia Provisions, this led to a fundamental rethinking of their business model and how they should actually be oriented towards the world. So with food, with agriculture, actually it is possible to actually create positive benefit, not just extract, sort of value from the world, but through, smart design of, planting and, sort of use of animals and mix of different types of crops. Actually, you could create, positive benefit to the soil, to the natural world. And they said, this idea that through their food business, they could actually create positive benefit was a fundamental, fundamental rethinking. And the idea of sustainability is really about keeping things the same, sustain. It's about maintaining the current, maybe getting a little bit better. And they really dedicated their business to regeneration. And he said, our previous mission statement, this is their old mission statement from the 1990s up until a few years ago, was build the best products and cause no unnecessary harm. He said this idea of causing no unnecessary harm means their business actually causes harm to the world. And this is something that they fundamentally wanted to avoid. And so they designed a number of practices such as recycling their clothing, repairing their clothing, creating secondhand marketplaces, as well as in their supply chain, making sure that they're using materials like cotton and others that are regenerative or 100% recycled. And they ended up changing their mission statement to we're in business to save our home planet. So I think this is an example of a company that has really thought deeply about its business model and how it can actually reshape it in a way that creates positive benefits, not just mitigates the negative externalities. A very important part of this, which I'm not going to spend, unable to spend a lot of time here today, is on consumers. I think a lot of times consumers, get blamed, for a lot of the waste in our world, and certainly we all should, consume less, less fast fashion, et cetera. But I think companies can also play a very important role in helping consumers sort of understand the importance of, buying less, having it be quality, and this has also been something that Patagonia has dedicated itself to. Here, the founder, Jan Chenard, famous for saying, consume less but consume better, and also things like on Black Friday, they've made a stand and said, please, think about consumption. The final example I want to give, because I've been here in Taiwan and seen a lot of work and interest around net zero. And this is really, really important. This is something also that I consider in the book, and about how companies can think about their business models in relation to carbon emissions. And so here's an example of Exxon, sort of one of the world's largest fossil fuel companies, becoming net zero, putting forward a net zero goal. This, in and of itself is sort of laughable to me that a company like Exxon could present themselves as net zero. And, if you actually peel back the layers of what they're talking about, you can see how they can. Although the fact that it's covered with all the major media with lauding them, I think actually, suggests that the media is not as critical as they should be. So a lot of net zero commitments, are just communication, not plans. So, we're going to be net zero in 2050, don't know how we're going to get there. Just an accounting exercise, basically. They don't actually, they actually try to exclude a lot. So Exxon's plans, if you look at it, that doesn't include scope 3, which actually includes their products, oil, which is basically 90% of their overall emissions. A lot of offsets are used, actually not fundamentally re-engineering their business. And also, typically someone else's problem. I don't think that the CEO necessarily is going to be, if you look at him around is the leader in 2050. So it's someone else's problem. So a company that's doing this very, very differently is Allbirds, the U.S. Apparel and footwear. I'm running out of time, so I won't say a lot. But they actually do what I sort of discussed in the book as looking backwards instead of forwards. So looks forward instead of backwards. So, Exxon, they say, okay, we're going to be 2050, and then this leaves this big innovation gap, which they have to think about, or they probably don't think about how to actually overcome it. But Allbirds actually looks at their existing production stack and how they can actually decarbonize each element of it, from using regenerative wool to different shipping methods, to actually how they can design their clothing better so that it needs to be washed less, how it can wear longer, et cetera. So I think that as many of your companies are thinking about net zero, and I'm sure you're part of the B Lab sort of net zero 2030 commitment, you're thinking about things like Allbirds, not Exxon, but this is, I think, something for our climate and world we need to be thinking about all the more. Just in sort of final points, the world is demanding so much more of companies these days, given climate issues, given inequality, as I mentioned. And you, as all businesses, have a huge, huge role to play in this. I think that the B Corp framework is an amazing starting point to do that, with the accountability framework, with the governance. But in the next phase, I think that companies are going to be needing to think much, much more about their business models, how they may actually create positive benefits, but also ways of overcoming and eliminating all the negative benefits as well. I think with the new CSRD and other European regulations, this is going to be much more on the forefront, and so the B corporations will be much more likely to be well positioned in this era. So thank you very much. It was wonderful to talk to you.